Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to our Monday night series. I'm Rochelle Wilhite. I'm the designated broker of Best Choice Realty. Tonight, we are going to be talking about how to prevent the worst closing. And I have had one, and I know Candace has had a few. There are some bad ones that we can discuss. So hopefully my intent or objective today is to make sure that this does not happen to you. But as we all know, if you've been doing this a long time, even with the best plan, you can still take some good tips and tricks away from people who do this a lot more than maybe you do. Of things you might want to look out for or take notes on. So this could hopefully prevent some of these worst case of closing experiences for you. So I think you'll get a good laugh on some of these ideas that I'm going to share tonight. Let's go to the next slide, Shannon. So the number one tip that I've trained most of you, but some of you I have not trained, is when you actually fill out your contract. One of my best secrets of having a successful closing is when you are using a closing team or a closing individual who you've worked with before. So on the contract, what you see on the screen here is a sample contract, not that saying that one title and escrow company is better than another. As many of you know, I have over 10, 12 really good closing teams or closing companies that I've worked with before. What I'm suggesting is that you look closely if you want to have a successful closing. One of the key aspects of having that would be on the contract in routing the file to a specific individual. So let's say that Candace has a listing. She's opened up title. Let's just pick one out of the mix here. She has title open with WFG. And then a closing agent, she's suggesting that we use a closing agent at WFG. And we're not in a multiple offer situation. We are seeing some different areas where you do get the right to negotiate. If you're in a multiple offer, keep the same WFG. But what you may want to consider, if she had not indicated who to use at WFG, is to select a closer or a closing team. In some companies, they have closing teams like this one right here that can actually handle your escrow. And what I found that when you select or you actually fill that part in on the individual or optional section, it says optional, in my opinion, as at doing this for over 20 years, I think I'm up to 25 now, it's always best to fill that in, to actually fill in who is the person responsible. For many years, I used Rhonda Munson. I have a closer at Chicago. I have a closer that's retiring at First American. So as my closer retires at First American, I'm going to need to form a good relationship with a closer or a closing team at the various companies. If you do not know somebody, if you're a new broker and you're like, I need to work with the best of the best, a simple text message to Candace or to me and say, Rochelle, I've never used somebody at Rainier Escrow. Is Team Sutton good? I could tell you, yes, they're good. No, you probably want to, put somebody else on the contract. But you as the buyer's agent have the ability to indicate that on that section of the contract. So while we could honor the Rainier title and escrow, we may want to suggest a different closer or a closing team in the optional section. And that's something that can be written into the contract so that you know you're getting the best service. So that's one of my key takeaways that can help you, because once you set forth in the contract, then that's the person you're going to be working with for the duration of the entire escrow period. The next slide here is closing details. So section F is probably the most, if you were to actually read, many of you do not read, or maybe you took classes many, many months ago and you're like, now I'm actually transacting and I need to actually understand this. This is the section that answers many of the questions regarding the closing details. So a simple read before you make a phone call to me or to Candace, or before you deal with a very interesting or challenging situation, you might want to read section F. Easy to remember. I always think F, you get a failing grade if you're having a a bad closing, and you might want to, before you pick up the phone or overspeak or share something that might be out of turn, you might want to quickly read paragraph F to make sure that you can't just answer your own question. All of the closing details, such as the difference between a final walkthrough and a final inspection, I want to cover that in a minute. The key exchange, when and how do you give keys? It's described in section F. How is a signing? When does that occur? It also, section F talks about what closing, it defines what closing is. Closing is when things are signed, funded, and recorded. That is when closing occurs. It's defined here in section F. And then it also describes when something happens where it's out of our control, or maybe we've indicated possession is not going to be on the closing date, how you handle forms 65A and 65B. Many of the challenges I deal with throughout the month, with delays, with expectations, with moving plans, the answer to the question, or how to answer the question, is right there in that paragraph. So I have line 77 memorized. I have the paragraph of where to find the answer memorized. So if you're a new broker, I would highly encourage you to go ahead and read your contract, specifically section F tonight, so that you know how to answer the questions about key exchange. How do I sign? When do I sign? What's funding? What's recording? What happens first, second, and third? Many of those answers are right there in that paragraph. So as I said earlier, the final walkthrough versus the final inspection, they used to, back in the old contract, this is before they revised the contracts in March of this year, they had a walkthrough that was in section in 22D. And they decided, in one of the revisions that they've revised on our contracts, they decided to go ahead in Washington State and make it, incorporate it into the purchase and sale agreement. So whether you're using a Form 21, a 28, it gives the buyer the right, or even a commercial sale, that gives them the right to do a final walkthrough of the property 5 days prior to closing. That has saved me so much time and headache by actually attending a final walkthrough. So my business practice, again, you can have your own business practice. I'm not going to tell you what you can and can't do when it comes to handling the closing details, but I can tell you for a fact, if I do not attend either the signing or the final walkthrough, my deal's off the rails. I know that about how things happen very quickly and it's very fluid at that point in time. And if you fail to have to do a walkthrough or have your client tour it, especially with things that maybe you've asked for in the inspection that can be addressed, you can't really, if you waived inspection, you can't come back and say, well, I want the property to be, this or that or the other. Let's say that there was a furnace that maybe had leaked and you waived your inspection. You certainly can, because it's considered a appliance or a fixture or a material part of the property, you can certainly go to the seller and say, hey, we did a final walkthrough and we need to have that remedied, or we need to have that fixed. You can't ask for them to replace the water heater, for example, in that case, if you had waived your inspection, but it is something that needs to be addressed. And it did come up on the final walkthrough in line 77. It talks about that. I know the line number. Seller will either, the way we viewed it, if there was something that was like, say, the garage door, I had this happen to me personally, garage door was bashed in, some kid kind of didn't stop all the way and it hit the garage door and it damaged the garage door. We did a walkthrough. I had to call the other agent and let them know that we did a final walkthrough and the garage door had a big gash in it. She's like, oh, I didn't even know about that. It wasn't like that when I took the key box off. I'm glad you brought that to my attention. So we had to extend closing to accommodate the seller hiring a garage door company to come and replace that garage door to make that right. And that's provided in this paragraph F, line 77. You can't negotiate repairs though. This is not the same thing as what's described in the Form 35. There is a section in Form 35, if you did not waive, say that you did do an inspection, there is a section in Form 35 for the final closing details that allows for a reinspection 3 days prior to closing. So you might want to consider that as you're handling the final closing details on whether your client needed to do a reinspect. Certainly you have to make contact with the same inspector that inspected the property for him or her to go out and re-inspect the property as far as the final walkthrough and / final inspection. That would be something that would have saved a ton of time, a lot of money saved if we were to identify maybe the seller did not complete the repairs in the fashion that we asked him for, and that inspector that inspected noticed that, maybe went down into the crawl space and saw that there was a ton of water and the insulation wasn't replaced. If we would have had the final inspection or the final walkthrough 3 days prior to closing and identified that, we can then properly work with the listing firm in that example to deal with that issue before closing, or to extend if we needed to make it right. Once we close escrow, once we close and give possession, it's near to impossible to get that seller to do anything. So any types of things like that you're running into some difficulties before close of escrow, that's where I usually hear from some of our experienced brokers. They're not exempt from some of the challenges that we all face when you're dealing with difficult clients or difficult situations. But the sooner you can alert me or let me know about those final closing details, the better it will be for you. So I can remind you where to find the answers or can communicate with the designated broker. So the real world scenario I'm going to share with you tonight is a property that I bought with my mom recently. We're in the process of closing, and well, I'm going to use the right phrase here. We have signed, we have funded, but we have not recorded and we have not closed. So it's a real life scenario. So kind of went like this. My mom wanted to buy the property. I co-signed for her. We got the loan documents drafted. They're sitting at escrow and we are ready to close. In fact, we're ready to close early. And so the sellers were really excited about that. So we looked at our contract. We decided we wanted to close on or before a certain date. We went ahead and drafted an addendum to say that. And now we're at the last weekend. We needed to negotiate an extension because what happened was the seller did not want to complete their signing. One of the parties that was supposed to sign didn't like the way the closing statement was prepared and wanted to go back to their attorney and have their attorney look over all the closing documents and all of the fees that were listed on the closing statement, and that delayed everything. Luckily for them, we know, because this was a neighboring property, and we were able to negotiate a rent back. So we're basically taking ownership, we're taking rental so we can do some of the repairs that are needed on the house, but that's not a common situation. Most of the time, if you're having some conflict at the signing, we highly recommend you negotiate an extension, not a rental agreement or a rent back, because that can be very, very dicey. So this is the actual property. My mom owns the red barn. That's where Shannon grew up. She wrote, not in the barn, but in a house that was on the property. And then what we decided to do is the property right off of the county line, they decided to put that house on the market as well. And because there's an easement that connects the adjoining property, it made for a very, very good investment property. We were up against multiple offers. And because I was able to put a strong, compelling case together, we were able to secure it and close very quickly. And there were obviously a lot of bumps along the way. So I'm going to kind of go through some of the things to keep in mind, because it was honestly for the year, just so you guys know, this is the worst closing experience I've had with this particular situation the entire year. And I've closed a few. Let's go to the next slide, Chan. So I'm going to go through a couple of the things here. So number one, things that kind of get overlooked, you got it mutual, right? Everything's signed around. The buyers have signed, the sellers have signed, and now you're working with lending and with title and escrow to clear things. One of the most overlooked forms that we actually, I challenge many of the people that I do one-on-ones with. I'm like, who's responsible for filling out the 22K? And depending on who you've trained with or what company you've come from, you're going to have a wide array of answers that I get when I ask that question. And so the answer to the question is the 22K needs to be filled out completely and sent to escrow soon after you get mutual acceptance. Hopefully you do it right at mutual acceptance and things are filled out. In my case, the listing agent did not have this pre-filled out. And so I included it with my offer in hopes that she would actually send this to escrow and send me a copy of it all filled out, but she has not done that. So another example of how not to have a bad closing experience, whether you represent the seller or the buyer. Best practice would be to make sure this is filled out and turned into escrow so they can order the proper payoffs. In my case, in this example of County Line Road property, the 22K was just like you see on the screen here. And I've had to, and Shannon's had to contact, and it's like we're pulling teeth to get some of this information. On my mom's property, it's on a well. On this particular property, we find out it's not on a well, it's with Lake Haven. So that needs to be properly disclosed. And you know, it has address and it has city, state, and zip code, really for the interest of escrow. I've talked to many escrow companies. They're just wanting to be informed by the parties on who these appropriate people are, and they can look up how to contact them. So even though it says address, if you want to just put the name of the company, that's at least a minimum standard. But then, you know, you get extra points, I could say, for putting a contact number, a phone number, an email address, a website, something like that would be helpful. Things that also can kind of get you held up at closing would be anything leased. In my case, we also had a leased item that was not disclosed on the Form 17. Again, another major issue. If you know, and you're the listing agent, and you've got a leased item, or you know that your client has a leased item, make sure that you put that on your listing. It was not on the listing, and it wasn't something that was disclosed in the 22K. And now we're finding out that we need to have a propane tank reading to understand how that there's enough propane in the tank to actually close out escrow and make sure the bills are paid off. Also, oil tanks have to be decommissioned. That is the seller's responsibility to make sure that the oil tank is decommissioned. Don't wait until the day before closing to have that talk with your seller, or to bring that up when you know it's an oil furnace. You might need to reach out to the listing agent and say, hey, there's an oil furnace. Is there an oil tank on the property? Where is that oil tank? And is there enough oil to supply? Usually there's a reading for that, to supply that property with the proper amount of oil in the tank. That is also something that should be handled. Again, don't rely on escrow to do this for you. It's between the parties. Escrow is meant to be a neutral third party. They're only going to check to make sure that the lienable utilities on the 22K are properly contacted. So if it's not lienable, then it's just you making sure, as you're helping your client, again, you can't transfer the utilities for them. You'll need to have them do that. And that work needs to be done usually, you know, at a minimum, right after you get mutual acceptance. At the most likely, it's like that last week where people are switching utilities and making sure everything's done. So if you've got unique things like leased items, oil tanks, septic tanks, you really need to kind of back up your dates and do that more upon mutual acceptance and have those conversations sooner rather than you are now. Let's go to the next slide, Jan. Additional co-signers. This happened to me as well. Horrible experience. So I knew this going into this property. Obviously, I'm a married individual. And so there would need to be another signer. I'm not joking. This escrow company that was helping us with this closing process, I did not even have an appointment set. So no appointment was set with my mom to come in and sign. I had to figure out how to get my mom in to sign the papers. The other thing that was not done until the day of closing was I got an email literally 30 minutes before I was signing papers saying that my husband, because this is a community property state, would also need to sign a quitclaim at escrow to make sure that he was okay with me purchasing this with my mom. Now, a good escrow company would have looked at the contract, determined, because of the way I wrote it, that I was buying this as an individual and I'm married. They would have asked some questions in their preliminary discovery to understand that my husband needed to sign. It should never have been 30 minutes before I actually had to sign my papers. So again, if you know that there are some additional considerations for signers, husband, but wife is not on the contract, but they're buying kind of like a unique situation like I was with my mom, bring that to your closer's attention, even if you're not working with a closer that you like or that you've worked with in the past. And also, same thing with power of attorney. We need the complete document, the original, that should be delivered to escrow. A death certificate should be an original. Make sure your client brings that in to sign. Bankruptcy, I had to bring in original because my father had passed away, so they wanted original. I don't think I got that request until like maybe a few days before. But the escrow company at least asked me to bring that, to give them a copy of it, or to bring, it was kind of unclear. So make sure your escrow closer is clear on what your client's going to need to bring into the closing table. And that if you have something on the left here, estates, bankruptcy, living trust, wills, power of attorney, divorce decrees, additional signers, quit claim deeds, anything that's got some complexity around that, most likely they're going to need to sign something, or you're going to have to provide some additional documentation before you get to the point of actually signing your papers. You can avoid having it go back to escrow. So this really did happen. So my husband, we found out like 30 minutes before that he had to go in and sign. Well, he was busy. He's taking kids to their performances. My kids play, we have school activities. He's shuttling. He's doing all of that work while I'm working with all of you guys. So I signed, was it a week ago, Shannon? I think we signed last week. I got the scheduling and communication. I believe we signed our papers last Monday after our webinar. Shannon and I bolted, we went in and signed our papers. My mom's still trying to find the location because escrow did not tell her where she needed to sign and scheduled the appointment with her. She didn't even know where to go. She's lost. She's driving around the parking lot. I mean, this really did happen. So it would have been better. Thank goodness I was there, but I was having to sign as well. If you're working with a first-time seller that has not signed for real estate documents in a very long time, make it a point to actually attend their signing. There's nothing wrong with that. I think I learned from somebody who's been doing this a long time. She says she never misses a signing. She makes sure that she's always signing, or that she's blocked out that time so that if I can't find the escrow company, I don't know what I'm signing, there's questions, she blocked out that time so that she's available. So her clients always see her at the signing, or they know that she's available during that signing, that they can call her really quickly. So I learned that, a very important lesson. And thank goodness I was there, because it just got worse. So then they had the documents prepared. We went in to sign on Monday. And we obviously, with escrow protocols, you can't go into the actual escrow office. So we're actually in this very cold lobby. And the documents came out, the closer came out, she had me sign with the notary. The notary didn't have the right documents. They had to go reprint twice. They had the wrong fees. They had the wrong payment. It was a disaster. And all the while, thank goodness my mom was late, because she would have been, I don't even know if it's meant to be. You sometimes have a buyer who gets to the closing table and for whatever reason thinks that something in the universe is stopping them from proceeding. And it has nothing to do with what you actually had found them the house, negotiate the details. They got the loan documents are at escrow, they're ready to be signed. And because the escrow closer, if my mom was sitting there, she would have been seriously having a panic attack, thinking that this house was not meant to be for her. Thank goodness I was able to be there and actually have escrow reprint, redo things to make sure that that was right, because it was a disaster. So then my two tips: if you can attend, go ahead and attend. If it's a first-time home buyer or first-time seller, definitely attend. Or at least make yourself at a minimum available to be contacted during that time. Because I had to actually call the lender to see if they could, provide that new document. Even the notary didn't even know what she was doing. She was like, "Oh, I'm so glad you found that." Literally, it's what she said. "I'm so glad you caught that." I'm like, oh my gosh. And I have all of you out there practicing real estate. And again, we're not supposed to be doing escrow's job, but we have at least a standard of care that we promise to our clients to make sure is happening. So when we look at this calendar, don't move yet, Shannon. I got one more thing to bring up on the calendar. When you're scheduling your closing date, please do not schedule your closing date on December 31st. You can avoid it. Over 75% of the closings that are scheduled to happen on the 31st will push into the next year, which also creates a lot of conflict for escrow, title, your clients moving trucks. It's never been a good best practice to close on the last day of the month. In fact, if I can advise my client, what day should I close, Rochelle? If I have the choice, well, certainly it's whatever your mortgage company can, get things done and make those documents happen at escrow. But if I was to say I was paying cash for a property, I would say I'd not close on the last day of the month. I would avoid Friday. at all costs, because signing, sometimes what they call table funding, signing, closing, funding, table funding, it does not happen all the time. In my case, it certainly wasn't not going to happen that night. When I signed papers at last Monday night, there's no way that they can close and fund and do all of that in the same day. So if you kind of work backwards and realize that there's a lot of things that can happen, sign earlier and don't close on a Friday or the last day of the month. That would be my best tip. Candace, do you agree with that? I'm just going to put you on the spot. Unmute if you could.
Absolutely. We could probably go back to all my closings and see that I normally do Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday at the latest. I prefer like a Tuesday, Wednesday closing, to be honest with you.
Just you get better service.
Things happen and you do get better service. They're available. It's not like that crazy rush, for the weekend, you name it. So yeah.
And that way, if you need an extension, which oftentimes you do because of circumstances, oh, my dog is is dying. That happened last week. Oh, I've got, somebody, my partner is sick. I mean, that has happened too. So again, you have to coordinate all these things. So you always work in the best interest of your client. And I agree with Candace. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday are my best tips. And then if you have to, then you get kind of put to the top of the stack, right, Candace, if we have to do some delaying, and then you probably end up closing on Friday anyways, but that's kind of the way to look at that. Also keep in mind that lenders need time. So escrow can only work, and I hate to throw escrow under the bus because this kind of is an escrow under the bus story today. But lenders have to work in conjunction with a lender. So you need to make sure that you're not blaming escrow when your lender actually didn't give them enough time to draw the documents. In this case, they had plenty of time. The lender had documents the week before, but lenders will sometimes blame escrow too. So they sometimes get caught in this kind of the middle ground where it's like, I'm getting it from all ends, right? I called my closer and she's like, this lender is a jerk. Or, that other agent is a jerk. So you don't want to be in that kind of communication rat race. You really want to be very professional and understand that your lender needs to get documents. If you want to have a successful closing, they really should be looking at the closing date. Say my closing date was, in this case, it was actually, I think it was Wednesday, the 8th. So because Wednesday, the 8th was the closing date, we had to get an extension. So we get another extension to the 15th. But my lender had documents there. You have to have at least 3 days before in order to have a good successful. They have time to process, collect, make sure they balance. It's called balancing. Escrow has to balance with the lender and make sure that it is the same as the closing estimate that they gave at the onset. At the signing, you got to make sure that your client brings identification. So in my case, made sure my mom had identification. I had identification. Where escrow did wrong was they coordinated with my husband to come in and sign. He brought his driver's license. Guess what? They took his driver's license. So they left it on the copy machine. So they had to make him come back again. My husband was livid. Again, another area where you don't want to have that happen. So realize that there are important documents that are handled. And if you have a good closer that is very, very particular about how things are done, COVID's really changed things up and created a kind of an uneasy, not easy to work with the office if you're going to go in. Many times the notaries will come to their house, which is great, but just realize that make sure you get your identification or any important documents, make sure you get those back if you're going to attend. Commission authorization, Form 40s, you probably should have done this before you get to the signing. At a minimum, if you're there, you can make an amendment to that. And then just make sure we talked about the understanding of making sure we understand the dates for mortgage. I think that was it, Shannon, on that slide.
Yeah, and just a quick plug for commission. So if you've got any sort of receipts that need to make their way to escrow, making sure that's done ahead of time, as well as if there were price reductions. You want to make sure you have an updated commission disbursement or a price increase. I mean, we've seen either during the course of inspections and negotiations. So if there's any sort of change, just make sure, double check right before closing, have I gotten an updated one to escrow, just to make sure that that commission comes to the firm correctly. The last thing we want to do is have escrow short us or have sent us too much money. It's often very difficult to fix after the fact. So do yourself a favor, make sure those are ahead of time sent to them.
Okay, perfect. So go ahead and pull up the, go ahead, next slide. Closing statement review. I'm going to give you just a few takeaways. I know I'm a little over on time, but it's important that we cover this in this segment. So if you could pull up the closing statement for review, they usually send a preliminary closing statement. And when escrow has balanced with the lender, or if you're a cash sale, they will have done this before your clients come in to sign. Now that we're in kind of a very high alert where everything's sent securely, I see a lot of you maybe not opening this up. I asked escrow, I said, how many of the agents actually open this up? They said very few. And that gives me I'm scared. After I experienced what I experienced last week, I was like, you should be opening all of your closing statements. Do not, because there was incorrect commission. There was a $10,000 utility thing they put on there. Again, my mom would have flipped a lid. And the sellers, like they did, that's why they had to go talk to their attorney and why we had to do the extension. Because if you look at this, estimated water bill to Lake Haven, $6,174, completely inaccurate. They were taking the number that was given to them by somebody else and by two properties and putting it together. So somebody didn't do their job at escrow. I'm picking on this particular example, but this happens more than you can imagine. And it gives me pause when I think about you guys getting these closing state preliminary estimates and you're like, oh, good, I'm good. It's like they're signing. I don't have to worry about that. All hands off deck. I'm just trusting, I'm assuming, we don't assume in real estate that escrow is doing their job. Many times you're dealing with people who are new at their job at escrow or companies that you may have not dealt with in the past, and they miss some things that are super important that could throw a bomb on your deal, and then all of a sudden it blows up on the day of closing.
Right. Like I think, I don't know, I'll pipe in too, Rochelle. I think one of the big ones that a lot of people forget about to ask, especially with their sellers, is about excise tax and sewer capacity charge. A lot of people who are selling their homes, especially first-time home sellers, they forget about those or they didn't know about them. And then they get a several $1,000 thing on here and they go, what's this $6,000 that's sitting here? I don't want to pay that. And the last thing we want to do is have some sort of issue like that when they're signing. It's best to prepare ahead of time. I think also we mentioned this on the previous slide is making sure you've got your receipts into escrow. I've caught this. I know I've caught this several times where you've provided receipts to escrow for reimbursement. Oftentimes the big one I think I've seen is resale certificates where agents are paying for those on behalf of their sellers, staging bills. I mean, you name it, I've seen it, but just double checking that those are reflected on the closing statement before your client sign. Because that way they know it's very clear and transparent.
Cool. So you will get the preliminary, open it up, and then what you're going to see is what you have kind of here. And you want to check, there's a few things you want to check. You want to look to the utilities, and then you also want to check the commission. So your commission is sometimes not, that's usually a clue adjustment. We're not asking you to do per diems and things like that. But you definitely want to check your, the sales price right there and the earnest money. Make sure that's in the correct line. In this case, that's correct. We did put 20,000. I've had people that put $25,000 and it's like, did they not even look at the contract? I mean, there has been serious clerical mistakes that happened. Luckily, this particular escrow company didn't do that. And then we got the loan amount and okay. And we're all good on that one. So really just the commission, the loan amount, and then the utilities. Those are the three things you really want to watch. As far as taxes and interest and things of that nature, you're going to want to just let escrow do those types of things, but you do need to check earnest money, purchase price, and then utilities. You also want to make sure the mortgage, that your client, if you're representing the buyer, they're going to sign a lot of things that you cannot control. It's already at that point. You can get the lender on the phone and ask the questions. And hopefully you've had several conversations with the lender up until this point, so you know who to call and to get the client answers to their questions. But the number one thing people ask at the closing table is, when do I have to make my first monthly payment? And so you just need to, again, at that point, just make sure they know where and when and how they go about doing that. In this particular situation, that was wrong on the documents. And I caught this. I caught this on the, when we were signing papers. They had not transposed the closing date correctly, which made us go into the following month. So because of the way that the loan was structured, my first payment's not until March rather than February. And that was not caught on the documents. And so we had to have that reprinted. So those types of things are things that you want to look out for when you're handling the final details with your buyer or with your seller. Any questions, Shannon? Did I cover everything I needed to?
No, I don't think we had any questions. You're welcome just to stick them in the chat if you want to get your questions answered. But I think one other quick mention, if you're representing a seller, I sure hope that, I know we've handled several kind of transactions that have been dicey near the end, where I wish our agent or the other agent had provided the seller with a net sheet when they had listed the property. I think it does eliminate a lot of conversations that are sticky near the end because it's a little bit more transparent. They kind of know what to expect in terms of their net, and they don't freak out when they see things that like title and escrow charges. They didn't know that that would be as expensive as they would. I've seen people like that. So just, I think if you haven't checked one out, I think one that we use is Tycor Agent One. Isn't that right, Rochelle?
I've used them all.
Yeah,
And
we've used them
there's
all.
even one on the MLS you guys can use. So
Yep.
we've had calls on that. No, great point, Shannon, on net sheets and making sure that, especially your sellers, have a net sheet going into escrow. We have a client right now where the seller sold the house. Everybody has signed their papers. And I'm not joking. The buyer has basically decided they're willing to forfeit their earnest money because they don't want to buy this house because they found out that there's more homeless people down the street. No joke, just happened. So this kind of begs the question, make sure you guys are asking for more earnest money too. As we start to transition and maybe you have more you have to negotiate with the buyer, you have to counter, just make sure that you're countering on earnest money so that you can at least keep the skin in the game high enough where they don't want to exit the contract on the day of closing. I still don't know if that one's going to pan out, Candace. It'll be interesting. I'll have to get an update from the agent tomorrow.
Wow.
Yeah. So that kind of stuff happens. It's really unfortunate, but even the best of the agents, we've been doing this a long time, we still will have a bad closing. But there are certain things that are, that we talked about tonight that will hopefully alleviate some of those things from happening to all of you.